So, as usual, the theme is a little bit critical, right? But I just wanted to show you a few things as to why we're doing this. First of all, as you know, we have all of these changes going on in Ecuador, right? With regards to the higher education law. And so I wanted you to become aware of or familiar with what are the biases on which we base all of Western academia, Western style academia. And so we're going to talk about what is Western style academia in comparison to other ways. Now granted, we have this university now called Yachay, which is very interesting. I would say it's a Yachay of Western style model, so we'll have to look at that later. In fact, let me show you this first before we do anything. This is the Reglamento de Carrera y Escalafón de Profesor Investigador del Sistema de Educación Superior, right? So we're looking at how professors can increase their level within the university. And so it's really interesting to look at all these different articles. Obviously, we're looking at what is the objective, the atmosphere, what academic professors should be doing, and also technical professors as well. And then they get into what are the different types of academic professors, right? And so we have different kinds of activities that you could do as a professor, right? Which is what we're supposed to be doing. Someday you should look into this to see if your professors are actually doing that, right? And then we have actividades de investigación, research activities. And what's really interesting, I want to highlight this one right here, that is the realization of research to recuperate, strengthen, and give potential to or more power to saberes ancestrales, ancestral wisdom, right? And one of the things that I would like to argue is that our entire model of how we generate knowledge and information will not be able to do that. Right? So this is what I want us to look at today. Okay, so there are 3 steps. Oh, I did this. 3 steps. Let's see here. I'm going to give you the definitions so that we can understand what we're talking about. We're going to review the naturalized partitions of Western style academia. What is a partition? It's just a separation. So these are different forms of separation that we take for granted within Western academia. And then let's talk about what does that mean then for how you learn, what you're learning, and what you'll be able to get out of the experience. So let's go to preliminary definitions. What I do in my work is called ontological philosophy. So you're wondering, okay, what does that have to do with international relations? It has everything to do with international relations and almost everything else, because ontological philosophy is to take a step back and look at how we create something like international relations or economics or sociology or anything like that, right? And I put through contrast because I use Andean philosophy as a window to understand how we do things in the West. Okay, so that's usually my approach. And we have 3 major concepts that might be difficult to understand at first. The first one is the primordial ontological assumption. Now, you know that ontology is what is in the world, and also how do I see myself hooked up to the world, right? Or the cosmos, right? And so the primordial ontological assumption is, are we assuming first complete interconnectedness, or are we assuming first separation? And then we're going to look at what does this mean later on. The ontological image is what becomes available once we make the assumption that it's either first connection or separation. Okay? That gives us a picture or an image through which we see the world. Okay, so the difference between the lenses is that the lens is this larger notion that has an initial assumption, whether it's separation or interconnectedness, and that gives us an image. And when we use this image, we use it collectively, like to form a culture, and that as we exchange ideas and interact, we create fruits. right? We reproduce and recreate the fruits of this image. Now, when I say the fruits, what I'm trying to say is that, first of all, the lens that we use bears a certain approach, bears a certain shape of fruit, and not a different fruit, right? And also that it's the way in which we reproduce it together. We actually co-create these fruits. And so there's nothing like eternal about them except for the fact that we're continuing to make them. Okay, so we have certain fruits that I'd like for us to look at. Western style academia, teleology versus the compass, and naturalized partitions. When I say Western style academia, I'm pretty much talking about all forms of academic practice, which means universities, schools, etc., that all base themselves around a debate that is focused on the scientific method, neo-positivism, and reactions to that. Now, what is a scientific method? You go into a hypothesis, you set up an experiment, etc. Now, it's not that simplistic. I'm also talking any academic approach that takes for granted social sciences as being separate from natural sciences, right? And you get that from the time you're in grade school, right? So when you separate those, that's already a separation that impacts what you can do with what you're learning. It already impacts how you're learning, right? And that's what I'd like for us to talk about. We will get into teleology of the compass and the natural partitions as we go through this. Okay, so we have these two different lenses. I'd like to go through the lens. We're going to compare their cultural manifestation, how they define one, because both cases have a different definition of one. And then we're going to look at the assumptions that accompany this definition and a few other things. So first, with the lens of complete interconnectedness, where do we see this? We can see this in Andean philosophy as it's practiced today, but we can also see it in pre-Columbian peoples and their beliefs, what they were able to transmit, as well as anywhere else in the world. We talked about this in cross-cultural communication, and you can see that before you had a westernization of the world, there were several native peoples that had originally started with the notion of we're all completely interconnected. Now, in different parts of the world, we had different manifestations of this, or different articulations of this. So in the particular case of ancient Chinese wisdom, we have yin and yang, right? That would be one manifestation. And you can see it in other places as well. Okay, so for the lens of separation, where do we see it? Pretty much Western style culture today, right? And we're going to go through how that's the case in a minute. So in the case of complete interconnectedness, the definition of one is the relation, okay? Whereas for separation, the definition of one is the unit or the category. So let's think about this. Let's just look at the mug for a minute. If the mug is the category or the unit, that's one through a lens of separation. Through a lens of complete interconnectedness, the one is the relation plus the two components. Or I could talk about the relation between the computer and the mug, that maybe the mug's too close to the computer, it might spill, etc., whatever it might be, but we're looking at the relationship first, and then the two components that are connected are secondary to that, okay? But if we start with the mug as being separate, then the relationship is secondary, okay? So this is where I want us to focus on, and all of Western academia assumes the mug first, and then the relation second. How do we see this? You take statistics, right? Yes. And when you took statistics class, you had to demonstrate the significance of the relation, right? The correlation. Do you remember how you had to take it out? So whenever you use statistics, what you're trying to demonstrate is that the relationship is actually significant or not. The relationship between the independent factors and the dependent factors, right? What's interesting, though, is that that already assumes that the factors are separate. And what you're trying to do is demonstrate the significance after that. Whereas if you start with the relation first, there's no question of the significance because it's already related. It's what comes after that becomes different, right? So we see this very differently through these two lenses, through these two images. Okay, so the assumptions that we have, the relations between the units is what permits the existence of the components. So I can't exist without you in the audience, and I can't exist without where I'm sitting in relation to the table, in relation to the chair, in relation to the windows, etc. Right? That's what allows me to exist. And it's all that relations. Now, what are the relations made up of? Energy, right? And so that's what allows me to know I'm alive. Okay? And so when I start with energy, then it creates a very different scenario than if I start with this exists by itself and I exist by myself, and then I have to figure out what the relationship is. Right? So when we look at the lens of complete interconnectedness, you're going to see that energy is what gives life, right? It is life. Whereas when you start with separation and you look at the cup, then energy or the relation is uncertain. Okay, so that's one thing that we really need to look at as we go through this. Okay, so it's really interesting that these two lenses have very different, they have a very different impact on how we see what's important in terms of grammar. So, for the lens that privileges the category, which is a lens of separation, the autonomous category or unit, then what do we see? A lot of grammatical emphasis on the noun. Why? The noun is a done deal. The noun exists as a substantive, right? Whereas in another approach, where you're looking at the relation, that's when you get the verb being more important. Why? Because you're living, right? So you're always living and you're always doing, so the verb becomes much more important than the noun. The noun assumes that it's already done. So what happens then is that we have another concept that results from this. If you start with the one as relation with the two components, which means you have an entire set of things, you're always going to have this both and experience. You can't think of the one component without contemplating the other component. So it's a both and situation. Whereas if you see the one category as separate from yourself, then you fall into an either or situation. And we're going to talk a little bit about what this means in a bit. Okay, and then we have a final focus of the lens. If I'm focusing on a relation, then my focus is actually on the relative balance of the components. Why? Because I can exist without that being in balance with me, and that can exist without being in balance with me. So the emphasis then becomes focusing on how the verbing of the relation, the actual happening of the relation, is in balance or not in balance. Okay? The moment you're separate, you fall into a focus on one, which is uneven. And when you have unevenness, then it tilts into a vertical scale, and you have to have one dominating the other. Okay? So we're going to look at these a little bit more clearly here. All right, so given what we've already seen, I'd just like to point out that there's 3 moments that I'd like for you to be aware of. The first moment, A, is like what we can see through the lens of complete interconnectedness and what you see a lot of in ambient philosophy. So either image is good. I'm trying to emphasize different things with each image. The first one, where you have a full circle with a dotted line through the middle, that's like, for example, up-down is in one circle. Left-right is in one circle. Masculine-feminine is in one circle. What do you have? Complementary opposites, right, that can only exist as a whole. And in Quechua, it's shuk or huk, right? It means one. But the one comes from both being together in relation. You can't have the one without the other, so there's no sense in talking about the one by itself from that perspective. So that's the initial starting point. Now, in the barbell scenario, what am I emphasizing there? Relation comes first, and the two components that are connected are not complete. They're never complete because they're always emerging. They're always being produced in the relation, okay? Which means that they're emergent and they're incomplete, but they are complete because they're already part of an energy. It's just that we don't see them as a substantive. We always see them as emerging phenomena, okay? Now, what happens is that this is what we call ontological ontological reductionism, which is kind of a hard term, but what does reductionism mean? It means that the world which you can see becomes smaller, becomes reduced. So in this particular case, we can see that from the first circle, you automatically assume separation, which means you separate the two components of the circle. Or, in the bottom case, you lose the relation and the other half when you see separation first. Okay? This is not the beginning step for the lens of separation. The beginning step of the lens of separation is over here. But you go through this whole process of reductionism. First you have the whole, which is the relation with the two components together. Then you insert separation, which means that you what? You lose the relation and you lose the other component, and you just focus on one half of the picture. Not even one half. You actually focus on less than one half, because you're only focusing on one component. The relationship becomes uncertain, and the other one is, yeah, maybe sometimes, if you want to consider it. Whereas in that particular scenario, you can't ever consider the one without the other. Up, down, left, right, whatever. So over here, what we end up seeing is that it's actually, from ambient philosophy, only a half of a circle, a half of a whole, right? But what we see it as is a unit. We see it as a circle. We think it's complete. Where do we think it's complete? We think it's complete on the ontological plane, which means that we're taking it for granted that this has some existence separate from me. Okay? And so when we do that, we automatically give it its own existence without taking into consideration the relations that create it. Okay? All right, so this is really, really important. Over there is where we have the starting position of the lens of complete interconnectedness, and over here this is the starting position of the lens of separation. Then if you want to take into consideration the relation, that becomes a secondary consideration. Okay? All right. So, let's go over a few, not caveats, a few descriptors of the lens of separation. We see separation first, right? The relation as primordial generator of life is denied, because you start with separation, so you can't see the relation first. You have to see it second. So without a relation, the first thing to which we pay attention is a disembedded component. Well, what is embedded? Embedded means it's totally connected, right? But when we see this, we see it as a unit by itself, so it's disembedded from everything else to which it's connected. Okay? So we take it as an ontologically autonomous category. Okay, and what's really interesting about this is, if you start with this picture over here, that category is timeless and spaceless. What do I mean by that? It exists without time and without space. It has its own existence that stands beyond the notion of a cup, the notion of a table, whatever it might be, exists without necessarily a necessary connection to an exact time-place conjunction. Okay? Now, what my argument is that when you start with this picture, you already start with what we call epistemic violence in ontological philosophy. What is epistemic violence? It means that you're not starting with the whole picture to start with, you're starting only with a part of the picture. So that in itself is already violent in the sense that it already eradicates part of what you could see. Okay? That's why it's called violence. There's no punching, kicking, physical violence going on. It's a violence that happens within your capacity to see what you see and how you see it. Okay? Then, what happens though, is that because we're existentially separate from one another, what happens? We then feel incomplete and uncertain. We don't know who we are and how we fit or anything like that. And so what happens is that becomes actually a necessary condition. Because we're separate, we feel incomplete. And because we feel incomplete, what does that have to make us do? Do exactly what Descartes told us, to start decreasing the amount of uncertainty. How do we decrease the amount of uncertainty? Science. But science as understood in Western terms, right? Okay. So what happens is we end up with a model that's totally fragmented. So when you see something, I'm seeing a room with separate chairs and with different people and individuals sitting in the chairs through this particular lens, and everybody's a fragment of reality. Whereas through the lens of complete interconnectedness, there's a reason why all these chairs and all of you are sitting together, and there's energy that's flowing among you, and between us, right? When energy flows, and you can start with energy as flowing between people or among people and everything else, including wood, including plastic, including metal, including everything that surrounds us, what happens is that's what I call the compass or the brújula, and in Spanish here a lot of people call it the pupo. Why? Because it's your initial connection to everything, right? It's your connection through your belly button. That was your initial connection to reality as we know it. So what happens is it's our way of guiding how we act in the moment. I understand that I'm totally interconnected to the whole. That's going to help me as I move forward through my relations. That's going to help guide me in terms of what decisions I make. Whereas when you start with a lens of separation, you completely lose being able to consider your energetic relations, which then makes you go through existential anxiety. So when you can't use the compass, then what we do is use what I call arbitrary teleological measuring sticks. And I'm going to get into what that means. So here we have the effects of ontological reductionism on the epistemological order of appearance. We're going to look at that next. So when you start with relations first, this is the epistemological order of things. You start with the relation first. Then you have emergent components in both cases. When you start with autonomous categories first, then the relation is a secondary thing. This is what I call epistemological order. So it's like the question, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And you can choose whatever you're going to choose. And actually, that's the really interesting thing about ontology. Most of us don't even realize that we're always making a choice about what lens we use in all situations. We normally just say, oh, well, I'm already separate. Why are you already separate? Because that's what everybody teaches you, right? So in this particular case, if you start with the egg first, right, then you get this whole picture. If you start with the chicken first, I mean in relative terms, if you start with the category first without taking into consideration its relation, that gives you this particular scenario. So that's the first impact of the primordial assumption of either separation or complete interconnectedness. Okay, so then when you're looking at complete interconnectedness, we're talking about the source of guidance. Over here, when you're completely interconnected, your source of guidance is your relations. It's every moment in the here and now, how you feel, and that actually gives you guidance as to how you move forward. Okay? Whereas, if you don't have that, you can't feel like you're connected to the whole, then what do you judge your actions by or according to? What I call teleological measuring sticks. So, for example, in this particular case, Western style academia says, I need to give you a grade, right? So and in the Ecuadorian case says, I need to give you a grade over 50, right? So then we have this line that says, well, this student actually is better than this student for this particular thing. So what I do as professor is apply a teleological measuring stick saying, oh, going from 1 to 50 or 0 to 50, this is where this student should be versus this student because this work is better than the other. Now, if you start from here, we shouldn't even be doing that because everybody is in their own place, in a perfect place as it is, right? And they're learning what they can as they can. So it's a very interesting thing. So the moment that we fall into this, but this is actually a lot more widespread than just grades in the academic setting. This is first world, third world. As an idea. This is modernization, barbarism, civilization, being savages. This is, I don't know, more sophisticated, backwards, modern, traditional. All these different ways in which you want to talk about it, right? So superior, inferior. So what we do, instead of focusing on our relations in the here and now, we start using these sticks to say, oh, well, I fit here. Why? Because we can no longer feel connected. So this is our only source of guidance to figure out how do you become a better person. Not even how do you become a better person, how do you figure out who you are? Well, I can figure out who I am because I'm living in a third world country, but it has a nice environment, right? So you start comparing and contrasting everything according to these different criteria. These criteria, though, are completely arbitrary, and they're human-based and human-reproduced. Whereas this means, do you guys hear, did any of you hear that bird singing outside? Mm-hmm. Yeah? We're connected to that bird. That bird's talking to us right now. You might not believe it, right? So in this particular case, you can either recognize that you're completely connected and say thank you for accompanying us, right? Or say, that has nothing to do with this experience right here. It has everything to do with this experience right here. We just don't pay attention to it, right? Whereas here, what do? Are you being good students sitting there quietly and attentively? Why? Because that's what you've been trained to do, to think this is what makes a good student. And unfortunately, as a mean professor, what do? Make sure that you continue this model of being a good student. Why? Because we're in an academic, a Western-style academic setting, right? This, though, because I as a professor am separate from you as students, and I'm judging you according to some external criteria, what does this tell you about yourselves? First of all, you're never sure about who you are, you never know where you stand, and you're just waiting to see what grade I give you on your papers. And then that'll make you feel better or worse, right? Depending on the situation. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter at all. So that's one of the things that we see here. Okay, so this is the third step of when you start with the assumption of either connectedness, interconnectedness, or separation. So in this particular case, what we're focusing on, again, like I said earlier, is dynamic harmonizing. You want to harmonize the relation because you understand I can't be me without you. You can't be you without me. So what we do is not try to dominate one another, but actually acknowledge and nourish that relation, right? Whereas here, once you assume separation, I have no reason to treat you well and you have no reason to treat me well, because it doesn't really matter in the end. And what actually happens is because we don't know where we stand based on our relations, we have to demonstrate that one is higher or lower than the other. That's the only way in which we can figure out where we are in the universe. Am I being a good student? Am I a better student than my neighbor? Right? Etc., etc. So these are very interesting things that we see. So here it says no compass. When you don't have your compass, you actually have to apply a teleological framework to see who's on top of whom. Okay? How does this work in Western-style academia? Well, we have these partitions. We have a first partition, which is a separation from the divine, and we can talk about that. We've talked about this plenty in international relations. And then we have 5 what I call centrisms. Well, what is a centrism? It means one thing is above the other. One thing's considered to be better than the other. And what's interesting is that in terms of separation from the divine, once we demonstrate, or once we decide that we're separate from the divine, that God is outside of us, or however you want to see it, when God is outside of us, we actually put ourselves in the inferior position. Obviously, you're supposed to be humble, right? That's the idea of God created the universe in area, right? So but that's not a centrism. It's a centrism focused on God being above us, but not you being above something else, or we being above something else. So that's a really interesting thing. That's why I leave it as separation from the divine, right? Where does that come from? I like to think of it, okay, separation of the divine from the divine is as far back as Genesis, okay? The writing of Genesis and earlier, so this is not a new concept. What became new in terms of how it affects academia is in the 30 Years' War. Why? Because we had the Protestants and the Catholics going to war about what? Which interpretation of the road to God was the superior interpretation? And 30 years of mass destruction created enough chaos in Europe for people like Descartes, Rousseau, and a lot of other people to start questioning, okay, what does it mean when you base society on religion, right? And that's where we had a separation between religion and the state, right? Religion and the economy, but also between religion and academia. So, as you'll notice, that most of the time we don't talk about God in class. In fact, you're not supposed to talk about God in class. That's anathema. Anathema, because we're already separated from divine, and we're going to talk about what that means. Then we have egocentrism, logocentrism, anthropocentrism, androcentrism, and ethnocentrism, not necessarily in that order as I present it in a minute. Okay, so what's interesting is that we get what I call a dualist donut. Where are we? We are in the empirical secular realm. Where is God? Way outside and way inside. In both cases, God is not accessible. Except for you can pray, you can do all kinds of things, but you can't know God like holding God's hand, right? So what we're existing in is in the donut part, and God is way outside and way inside. So that creates this dualist understanding of society or of reality. And what do we base our research on? Only that part. Now we're going to talk about what this means. Going into anthropocentrism, anthropocentrism means humans see themselves as being superior to all else, and in this case, nature. We'll just leave it as nature, right? So what's really interesting is that you go from having the dualist donut of separation from God, and then you have a separation between nature and humans. Why? Because that's what we received in the Bible. I mean, in Genesis 1:28, it says, go forth and reproduce, and then submit. Go forth and multiply, and then use the flora and the fauna for your use. So human beings are higher than the flora and the fauna, right? Animals and the plants. So we get this separation of humans from God, and then a separation of humans from nature. That's where we get the division between the social sciences and the physical sciences or the natural sciences, right? And we have this difference. These are our roots in Western academia. So then, we then have a separation. Well, humans are actually separate from nature, so we can't see them as making an actual whole donut. And in this particular case, humans usually are superior to nature, not in the sense that Mother Nature can't create an earthquake, but that we as humans, we are sentient beings with reason, which means what? We can figure things out. Right? So that's where we get this notion of anthropocentrism, where human beings are on top because we can use our brains and we can come up with a strategy known as methodology to figure out how things work in the world. Right? So we have environmental devastation. Well, we need to figure it out. Who's going to figure it out? We will. And who will carry it out? We will as human beings. So there's this focus on human beings' ability to study it and actually implement it. Okay. When you see yourself as separate from God and you see yourself as separate from nature, which are the two major assumptions about reality to begin with, then you also see yourself as a single categorical unit, because the moment that you're separated from the divine, you can't acknowledge the energetic connection that we all share, because that falls into the realm of the divine. It's part of that part that we can't see, right? And so what that does to us, it puts us into little enclaves of single individuals as atomistic units, right? And it also can happen, egocentrism can also happen inside the human being, because we see that there's an inside when you use this particular approach. So the mind is separate from the body. If any of you do sports or lift weights or exercise or do anything like that, usually you're just trying to say mind over body. Why? Because you're being told that your mind needs to dominate your body. You need to run a faster kilometer. You need to lift more weights. You need to get in better shape, or whatever it is. And so what do you need to use? Your mind to dominate the body. It's very much based on this teleological notion. The id, the ego, and the superego, that's also, well actually it's backwards, but the superego being on top, outside, the ego is what we have access to, and the id is that thing that's inside your instinctual impulses, right? So we get this notion of egocentrism as either the ego, which is your conscience functioning, or ego as the one person in society being separate from all of everybody else. Okay, so egocentrism happens on 2 levels. Now we have logocentrism, which also happens on 2 levels. Logos means logic and word, right? So in the first case, logocentrism means that you use your mind over your body and everything else. I put it in here. This is a picture from Javier Lajo's work with many changes. The idol has at the top, this is the notion of yachai. Yachai is thinking, right? But it's in relation to the middle part, which is ruai, and the bottom part, which is munai. Munai means love or feelings. Why was it down there? Because that's where you reproduce, right? That's the whole notion. Now, you have love and feelings, and you have your thoughts and your thinking, which is air. The love and the feelings are water in terms of elements. And how do you integrate them? In your doing of every day. The moment that you assume that you can separate your mind from everything else, then your brain becomes superior to any other sensation that you get, even hearing the bird that was outside, right? You're supposed to be thinking, you're supposed to be engaging, you're not supposed to be hearing something, the lawnmower or whatever it might be outside, okay? Or if you feel cold or you feel thirsty or whatever you might do, that's secondary to your brain functioning. Now, logocentrism, when logos means word, it also means the major reason why we see ourselves as separate from nature, both animals and plants, is because we have a language. We don't see the fact that we share a different language with all, right? So when we use English or Spanish or whatever language, that's an instance that we take for granted to say that we are separate. That's a way to demonstrate that we're separate from the whole, because we can use a language and understand each other. And if I say that to, I don't know, a fish, the fish is not going to respond to me, right? So clearly the fish must be separate from me because of my language. So there are people within that use the lens of complete interconnectedness that can communicate with clouds, and they can stop the clouds right where they are. I've been there. I've seen a person stop a huge thunderstorm right next to where we were standing. How does that happen? I have no idea. Right? Except through energy. Now, I haven't gone practicing it because I'm busy writing papers on the difference. So I'm still using the reason part to try and demonstrate certain things. So it's very interesting how we have both logocentrism and in 2 senses. All right, then when we have androcentrism, this is a very interesting one. What is androcentrism? It means you put the masculine above the feminine. Okay? Now I want to show you, this happens on 2 levels. The first level is a little bit difficult to get across in a Western understanding of things. Energetically, the electric impulse of separating out is masculine. The magnetic impulse of pulling everything together is a feminine impulse. Okay? Well, I'm going to leave it at that. And so when we analyze, when we separate things out, when we divide things up as we do in Western style academia, that's privileging the masculine thrust, energetically speaking. All right? But then we have this other one that I just want us to remind us of. So for the end in hook-based relation, masculine and feminine are complements. Masculine and feminine do not mean man and woman. It's very different. Masculine and feminine are properties that we all have as human beings. When we have these properties as human beings, some of us have more feminine impulse than masculine impulse. Others of us have more masculine impulse versus feminine impulse. What we do, though, is when we attract another human being, we actually attract complementary profiles of masculine and feminine combinations. Okay? Just leave it at that. So that can like really explode notions of what it means to have either heterosexual relations or any kind of other relations. It's much more an energy thing than it is female body, male body, okay? Now, you do need a female body and a male body to reproduce, and that is important in terms of Andean philosophy. So I'm not gonna throw that out, but it is important to think that when I'm talking about masculine and feminine, I'm talking about an energetic impulse that's related to electric and magnetic, okay? Very different. So, when we separate those two, and we see them as separate, we then see them as bodies, which is really interesting. So you're looking at the male body and the female body and not at energetic impulses, okay? This is where you get it. So the moment that you separate the energetic impulses, that's when you start focusing more on male, female, sex, and gender roles, okay? And over here then, you have the teleological notion. So in terms of masculine and feminine, what has won out over time? The masculine. Why? Because of physical power. Now, this is not a bad thing. This is just what happens when we see the world through separation. Now, I want to go through, just to demonstrate to you how this affects what you're learning, okay, with the case of androcentrism. I'm going to talk about the case of Western-style feminism. We're going to talk about Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir was writing half century ago, and she was very disturbed, actually a little longer, but she was very disturbed by how women were subjugated in society. And she wanted to come up with a response to help women not be so subjugated. So what happened was that she was not seeing the sexes as being complementary. She was seeing the sexes in these terms because that's the reality she was living, right? Men are getting paid more, women all they have to do is stay home, they're mistreated, they're not honored, they're not respected, etc., etc. She's using this ontological image from which to base her perception and on which to base her future strategies. So this is a really important thing. So what she does then is that when you take this case, this is how she comes up with what's called the second sex, the deuxième sexe, as she says in French. She says, okay, I'll give it to you, men. We are the second sex. What does second mean? We're lower on a teleological measuring stick. That's okay. But what should we do to get out of our situation? If we want more honor or more respect, or if we just want to have a place in society where we don't feel like we're always on the lower end, what do we need to do? Become like men. So what happens is, instead of having this situation, you take the bottom half and you flip it up. Okay? And that's what gives you actually Western-style feminism. Western-style feminism says that women, understanding that we're the second sex, we need to actually act like men in order to become respected in society. So what are you doing here? We're all here supposedly learning. We're all here supposedly to get our career, to have a profession, etc., etc. Why? Because we weren't taught that being complementary, actually, there's a way to be honored and respected when we start with complementariness. But because the Western lens doesn't even allow that, we can't even imagine what that is like. So the formula that we're using is actually this formula. But what's very interesting about that is that that loses balance. Can you see how this creates disequilibrium already? Because you have all sexes heading toward one energetic thrust, okay? And which actually, I would argue in the United States, many women have problems with fertility. Many more women have problems with fertility than down here, for example, in Ecuador. And a lot of it has to do with the competitiveness, all the different things that women feel obligated to do to be able to be respected within society, right? So it's a very interesting thing. Going back just to close up Simone de Beauvoir, this is not to blame Simone de Beauvoir's work. And it's not to blame the work of many feminists in the West. I call it androcentric feminism, which is very strange because it means that it's a masculine feminism. But it's a masculine feminism because it forces us to have more of the masculine impulse. What's really interesting though is that she was responding based on what? A shared ontological lens. And she was using a shared ontological lens, and she was coming up with a strategy based on the way in which she could see her world. And the way in which she could see her world was already reduced. Because her view of the world was reduced, her strategies were also reduced. Okay? So that's one of the things that I just want to put out there as a notion. Okay, so the final partition that we see within Western style academia is ethnocentrism. So that's already anthropocentric because you're already just focusing on human groups, right? And what is ethnocentrism? It is to assume that there's one coherent group that's superior to another group. Okay? So what happens is we assume that our way of life, well, who's the all? Our. It's this notion that I can identify who we are based on shared characteristics. Does that group really exist? Well, you could say it exists, but not in the atomized terms that we are assuming in the lens of separation. And we don't have to demonstrate, if you use a lens of complete interconnectedness, you don't have to demonstrate superiority. Actually, difference is embraced because difference allows you to see who you are, right? Okay, so when you assume that your way of life is superior to others, then you also have this impulse to make others look worse. So the North is more modern than the South, right? The globe has the North appearing on the top half and the South appearing on the bottom half. These are the effects of using a lens of separation. When we use a lens of separation, it automatically means that we need to not take into consideration balance first, but try to dominate first. Or at least see where we fit in this hierarchy of domination, right? Okay. This might be a little far out, but I just want to show one thing about how we can see methodologies within Western style academia, especially within international relations. And you will learn this in contemporary thought next semester. But we have two they're at war, two ontological orientations. Now one's called dualism, and that's where we find neo-positivism and critical realism within international relations. We will learn all these next semester. And then we have what I call truncated monism. And they see themselves as being the opposite of critical realism and neo-positivism. And we have reflexivity and analyticism. These are the groups of like post-structuralism, postmodernism, constructivism, etc. Okay? You'll see those here. But what's really interesting is that all of these approaches assume still separation from the divine, anthropocentrism, and logocentrism in terms of language. So when you're focused on post-structuralism or postmodernism, you're focusing on discourse. When you focus on discourse, you're only looking at the human realm, which is why they have a hard time applying post-structuralism to science, let's say, meaning hard sciences, right? What's interesting though is that this is like a long continuum of separation to complete interconnectedness. And what you get here is what we call knowledge generation. What is knowledge? A substantive. You think it's already done. Over here, what do you get in terms of complete interconnectedness? That's what I call robust monism. You get knowing. It's a knowing how to be in the moment. That's it. The here and now. Can you accumulate it? No. You practice it, you live it, you do it. It's a very different approach. So in Western science, what we spend our time doing is accumulating knowledge, generating, producing knowledge to demonstrate that we're making progress. There's no progress to be made. That's an arbitrary teleological measuring stick, this notion of progress, right? So it's very interesting that the realm from that dotted line over here is what we see in Western style academia, and over to the left is what you can see in Andean philosophical practices, for example. Right? A serious focus on the present tense here and now, and you can't even separate time from space. It's only right here, this moment, in each of us, that we're experiencing. It's a very different concept. So you can't really produce knowledge because you're just living in knowing. Okay, 4 major things when you assume any degree of separation. First, any degree of separation, when you privilege it first, this generates epistemic violence through reductionism, okay? And that means that you then tend toward teleology and not using your compass, but using these other things as a way to figure out where you are in the world. And it only acknowledges one energetic principle. When you separate, you separate it, you only can acknowledge the masculine energetic principle, which is separation. If you have everything integrated into one, because they're connected, you can have the masculine thrust toward separation and the feminine thrust toward magnetic or integration at the same time. Okay? So when you use separation first as your first primordial assumption, you then must use androcentrism, or the masculine element only. That's the only one that you can acknowledge, which is what all of Western style academia is based on. Okay? And then you privilege imbalance first because you're only looking at one component of the whole at a time. And when you look at one component of the whole at a time, it's uneven. You don't have 2 components that are in relation, which then forces us to try to be even. All right? And what happens is that, how do you see difference in this model? You see difference as a threat, or we see difference as a threat. So you have to annihilate it. You have to get rid of it. Difference is bad. Difference is threatening, because it doesn't allow you to figure out where you stand in the world. If somebody or something is different, that destabilizes your framework for understanding who you are and how you stand in the cosmos. Whereas if you see difference via complete interconnectedness, that helps us to embrace it and see it as a contrast that helps us to see who we are. It's a very different approach in terms of difference. Okay, the good news is, because energy is eternal, no matter what you try to eradicate, it never goes away. Because energy is eternal. So you can try and kill things, you can try and subjugate minorities or women or anything else, and guess what? They never go away. So you get to keep getting a chance to learn. That's the best news, right? And the other good news is that once you realize that you can consciously choose to use one lens or the other, you then know that you make the choice. And you can actually make a difference in how you see yourself in relation to the cosmos and everything else, right? So, this is all. Are there any questions about what does this mean for your lives as students? Or what does this mean for your lives as researchers? Or what does this mean for your lives as human beings? You're being good students now by slipping. Okay.